In the offseason, Nevada fired head coach Ken Wilson, which means they have a new leader of the pack in Jeff Choate. He comes to Nevada being the linebackers coach at Texas. What can you tell us about Coach Choate and what he brings to the table for the Wolfpack?
It's a different personality from Ken Wilson. Ken Wilson gave a lot of years to Nevada. He was either an assistant coach under Chris Alt or on Alt's administration as an associate athletic director for 22 years. So, he had a lot of roots with the Wolfpack. He spent 9 years in the Pac-12 at Washington State and at Oregon. So came to Nevada 2 years ago and went back to back 2 and 10 seasons. A new athletic director was in charge. So the plug was pulled on him. And Jeff Joe brings a lot of energy, brings a lot of passion. This is a guy that's very high energy. He's very contagious. He's very motivational. And he's been a head coach before, which is different than Ken Wilson. Ken Wilson had never been a head coach before, even though he was in his upper 50s. Jeff Choate spent 5 years at Montana State and had a lot of success there. He ended up actually stepping down because the pandemic year 2020, FCS wasn't playing any football, got an offer to be co-defensive coordinator at Texas and linebackers coach. He had worked at Boise State with Texas's defensive coordinator at the time. So decided to make that move. It was a tough move because whenever you're a head coach, you don't want to take that step back, but he figured eventually he'd be able to become a FBS head coach if he did make that move. And, a couple of years later, that was the case. So, at Nevada, he inherits a big rebuild. You're talking about 4-20 over the last 2 years, 16 of those 20 losses by double digits. Last year, average margin of defeat of 16 points per game. Last 2 years, Nevada's had more interceptions and touchdown passes in both of those seasons. So, this has been a proud program for a lot of its history. Prior to the last 2 years, they had made a bowl game in 14 of the previous 17. But certainly he's taking it at a low point. He's going to try and get it back to at least the bowl level and maybe to a Mountain West championship level, which Nevada has not been able to reach since joining the Mountain West in 2012.
Well, as it often happens when you get a new head coach, that means new assistants and coordinators. Nevada's no different in that regard. Coach Choate brings over Matt Lubbock to be his offensive coordinator. Lubbock was previously an analyst at Kansas. Can you describe the type of offense that Coach Lubbock brings with him and plans to run there at Nevada?
So it's a unique situation because Coach Lubbock wasn't with Nevada during spring camp. He was actually still battling leukemia. The prognosis is very, very good. So he was able toward the end of spring camp to do some, Zooms and be a little bit more involved remotely. He should be on campus here when fall camp starts in late July. Nevada's playing a week 0 game, so they start a little bit earlier. But, you look at the history, and I think it's going to be a run-oriented kind of offense. When Jeff Choate was at Montana State, they ran the ball just shy of 65% of the time. Their quarterbacks were very involved in the run game. Coach Choate likes to call it a vertical run, vertical pass attack. He does want to get the ball down the field with the passing game, and he thinks the best way to do that is by, making people have to stack the box, being able to get 5 yards per carry. So I think when you look at Nevada's offense, it's going to be a lot more run first than it was during its last successful tenure. That being the Jay Norvell tenure. Jay Norvell was Nevada's head coach from 2017 to 21. Ended up going in conference to Colorado State over some quibbles about salary and facilities and other things of that nature. That was an air raid offense. So it took Ken Wilson a couple years to try and get more to a run-oriented offense. And I think Jeff Choate's going to be the same way. He's going to want to run the ball. And Nevada's offensive line has not really been all that good over the last decade. So I think that's the biggest area of improvement to establish the kind of offense Nevada wants to run under Jeff Choate.
Well, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense. That's the quarterback. Brendan Lewis returns, as well as A.J. Bianco. Lewis was the starter, but A.J. also saw some game action last year. And then the new staff brings in Chuba Purdy from Nebraska. How did the quarterback room look in the spring, and did anyone emerge as a starter?
No, nobody emerged as the starter, and honestly, they're not going to name a starter and probably until a couple of days before their season opener, August 24th against SMU. Brendan Lewis did have some really good play when he was at Colorado in 2021. He started the Buffalo's 2022 opener, then was benched and hit the portal before Deion Sanders was named the head coach. So, he was Nevada's primary starter last year. He was not very effective. I think that was more scheme-based and personnel around him based than anything. This is a former 4-star prospect who's had success in the Pac-12. He's a very good athlete. He can run the ball. He doesn't have a lot of history of success getting the ball down the field. A lot of it's been more horizontal passing. And I think the chief opponent is going to be Chuba Purdy. He is the younger brother of Brock Purdy. He has started games at Florida State and Nebraska. Hasn't been able to retain those starting positions. was actually committed to San Jose State, a Mountain West foe of Nevada, right before Brent Brennan ended up going to Arizona. Reopened up his recruitment after that, and about a week later, he committed to Nevada. He was limited in spring camp. He was coming off an injury, so he wasn't full contact until about the last week or two. So maybe you didn't get to see the full Chubba Purdy. But those two, plus a junior college recruit, Anthony Grigsby Jr., he was at the College of San Mateo, probably like legitimately listed at, he's listed at 5'11". He's probably closer to 5'9". But Jeff Choate seems to really, really like what he has in terms of his overall package. And you mentioned AJ Bianco as well. He's a kid from the Hawaiian Islands. He did play a little bit as a true freshman last year. Had some ups and downs. He's a really good athlete. But I think when all is said and done, I think Brendan Lewis is going to start. If things don't go well with him, I think Chubba Purdy is next in line, and then probably Grigsby even before Bianco. But I know Jeff Choate likes the depth of that position. You're talking about two former four-star commitments and, 3 guys who had Power 5 offers coming out of high school. So I think the talent is there. The scheme has just been very problematic the last couple of years in getting the most out of those talents.
Moving over to the running game, their leading rusher and workhorse back from 2023, Sean Dollars, returns. They also brought in a lot of guys from the portal. Makes sense. You said they want to run that ball. Patrick Garwo, the second, transfers in from Boston College. Post-spring guys like Destin Hawkins from Syracuse, Kai Woods, and Savion Red both come from Texas. Of the guys that were there in the spring, how did the running back room look to you?
So there were a lot of injuries, unfortunately. Sean Dollars was kind of one of the healthy guys. He originally came from Oregon, was on Nevada's roster last year, like you said, led the team in rushing touchdowns. He's more of an all-purpose back than a kind of between the tackles back. Unfortunately, he did had to get carted off at the end of their spring game. They basically ended the game when he suffered an injury. We believe it to be a concussion. He also missed some games last year with the concussion, so that's definitely something to track. Patrick Garwo, he's the guy who's been all conference in the ACC at Boston College. He missed all of spring camp with an injury. Ashton Hayes, he's a local Reno product who began his career at Cal, came to Nevada last year, tore his ACL. He also was out for spring camp. And then those 3 most recent guys you mentioned, a couple of guys from Texas and a kid from Syracuse, they're coming after spring camp. So you're talking about 6 guys who have played power conference football. Just not a lot of them have been healthy in terms of recently, but I do think it could be a solid position. I think I'm looking at the offensive line to become better. Like Chris Alt is kind of known for Nevada football. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame. He was the guy who created the pistol offense to get the most out of Colin Kaepernick, had 3 different tenures with Nevada, won more than 225 games with the Wolfpack, got him all the way up to 11th in the country in 2010. It was all about that offensive line. They had a lot of guys at skill positions get to the NFL like a Colin Kaepernick, but that offensive line was so dominant. Every year, 3 guys on the all-conference team, guys going to the NFL. Joel Bitonio might be a Pro Football Hall of Famer. It was probably his last great offensive lineman. He's now with the Cleveland Browns. Another kid named Austin Corbett won a championship Super Bowl with the Rams, now with Carolina Panthers. That offensive line was always dominant under Alt, and it has not been great the last decade since Alt resigned after the 2012 season. So I don't think the running backs are an issue from a talent perspective. I think there's enough there. If I had to guess, Patrick Garwo, Sean Dollars, those are probably your top 2 guys. But it really comes down to that offensive line being able to set the tempo and the tone for this team, which it's not really been able to do, even during some successful seasons over the last couple.
So you mentioned Sean Dollars suffered that injury there in the spring game. How's he doing?
He's doing well. He's expected to be fullback when training camp starts. So, it's always a concern when you're talking about multiple head injuries within a 1-year period. So that certainly is something to track. It was a very scary situation. They had to take the ambulance out. They had to mobilize him. And, they were just trying to do a couple of red zone drills to end camp. The spring game was more or less over, and they were going to do a couple of things in the red zone. And the first play of that red zone series was when he hit his head on the turf. So, he should be good and he should be healthy at the start of the season.
Then you mentioned, having 2 backs there and not having a workhorse kind of like you did last year. Do you feel like it's a 50-50 split, 60-40, a hot hand approach? How do you feel like that's going to be this year?
I think it's a wide open position, just like a lot in Nevada. I think everybody got a fresh slate with Jeff Choate. I think Jeff Choate is very high on Patrick Garrow in terms of his leadership and his rushing ability. I think Sean Dollars comes with a lot of accolades as a high school recruit, and he did take on the majority of the load last year. So I think it's going to comes down to who's healthy too. Because you look at Patrick Garrow, he was the All ACC second team 1 year. Outside of that, a lot of injuries. So it's who can be healthy. Obviously, those two guys from Texas, Jeff Choate was going against them. I mean, those guys were both walk-ons with the Longhorns, and obviously Jeff Cho, was running the defense, so those guys would have been on the scout team. So, I think we can sit here and try and predict who's going to get the most carries, but I think you got to get into the season and see who's performing the best. If I had to guess, I would say Garwo was probably the leading rusher at the end of the year, but I certainly wouldn't rule out any of those other guys. I mean, Ashton Hayes is another one, the guy I mentioned originally from Reno, who began his career at Cal. He's a very, very fast back. But a lot of those guys are more like all-purpose backs. I think Garro is more between the tackles guy, and I think that's the style of run game that Jeff Cho wants.
So, what are your thoughts about those post-spring transfers? Are those more depth moves, or with injury concerns, or what were your thoughts around those guys?
So Nevada did lose 3 running backs to the transfer portal after spring camp. Cross Patton, he's actually the son of Big Boy from Outcast. He entered the portal. A couple of other kids who were younger in the program. You didn't see a lot of transfers for Nevada after the coaching change. You did see significantly more after spring camp as Jeff Choate got to get familiar with the players and vice versa. A lot of times that's the coach kind of saying, you probably don't have a role here. Let's find another home for you. So, I wouldn't be too alarmed. Nevada did lose, I think it was 16 players from the roster at the scholarship level after spring camp, but that was kind of by design to try and get a feel for each other. And then Jeff Choate had to make some decisions on, who's fully bought into his program. He's been pretty transparent that he basically wants like 80% of the team bought in for the season opener. He's not giving, delusions that everyone's going to be fully bought in. At the end of spring camp, he said it was right around 50%. So, I think that was some pretty natural attrition. And you did definitely see a lot of attrition at the running back position in particular.
Moving over to the wide receivers, they look quite a bit different in 2024. John Jackson III and Isaiah Crocker graduated. Delvion Campbell's off to South Carolina. Spencer Curtis hits the portal. Darian Wiley comes in from Louisiana Monroe, and then he goes off to Vanderbilt in the spring, and then Jamal Bell heads over to Baylor. How did the staff address these losses?
I think that's the biggest area of concern on the offense for me. I mean, they returned basically like a career 4 catches from all their returning wide receivers. And then they lost the key tight end, Kaleki Latu, began his career at Cal, went through the team with spring camp. And then his brother was actually the first defensive player picked in the NFL draft. He was out at the NFL draft. I think that kind of put him on radar for some teams and ended up transferring to Washington after the draft. So you look at wide receiver, that's definitely the biggest area of concern. I think Cortez Brahma Jr., he's a transfer from West Virginia. I think he could play a big role. There's a local kid from Bishop Manogue High School in Reno. His name is Marshawn Brown. He's a guy who I think can get a lot of playing time. Nate Burleson, a lot of people might be familiar with him. He played in the NFL for a decade, and I was on the CBS morning show, both the news and the NFL Sunday show. His son, Nate Burleson II, is on the roster. He actually injured his hand, broke his hand during the spring game as well. But he's a very long, athletic, fast kid, just like his dad. So they're going to be relying on a lot of young guys, a lot of unproven guys at that wide receiver position. I think that's why I emphasize the run game even more, because you got questions at quarterback. With the last couple of years not going very well, you got questions at wide receiver, and then you got questions on the offensive line in terms of whether they can pass protect consistently. So you add those 3 up, and to me, you really do have to establish that run just because the infrastructure is not quite there to be an effective passing team in year 1 under Jeff Choate.
It might be tough to answer right now, but who do you think lines up there week 1 against SMU at wide receiver?
Yeah, I think Cortez Brahma Jr., he's one of 2 representatives. Nevada's taken to Las Vegas for the Mountain West Media Days, so I don't think you do that unless you have a big role for him. I think Marshawn Brown, that is a kid who originally was born in Texas, moved to Reno, 6'4", was one of the fastest players in the state in track as well, and he had a really big spring game, caught a touchdown, showed like he was ready to go out there and play, so I think he's probably your number 2 guy. And then number 3 it's wide open. They did bring Charles Brown in. He's a transfer from Texas State, brought him in after spring camp. I think they're pretty excited about him. They actually did a a volunteer softball game against local law enforcement in the AAA stadium here, and he was one of the better softball players. Not to say that's going to translate to football, but just shows that he's a really good all-around athlete. So those are probably your top three, with Nate Burleson the second in there as well. But it is very thin. I mean, Nevada has under Jay Norvell in that air raid, they had a ton of really good pass catchers. Romeo Dobbs is now with the Green Bay Packers. Cole Turner came here as a wide receiver, ended up being a tight end, but he was basically a wide receiver. He's now with the Washington Commanders. So they have not been able to replace those guys. Elijah Cooks, also during that Jay Norvell era, he's with the Jacksonville Jaguars. So you're talking about NFL level guys. And now, a couple years later, you're just hoping that these guys who are redshirt freshmen can go out there and play immediately. So, I think that's going to be a big ask for them. But if Brahma's probably going to be your top wide receiver this year.
Well, let's move over to the tight end room. Based off what you've seen and heard, can you describe for us how you expect the tight ends to be utilized in this Lubbock offense?
Yeah, I think you're going to see a lot more two tight end sets. As I mentioned, Kaleki Latu transferring was a big blow because he was really the one guy who could stretch down the seam, who was a big threat in the passing game. They did bring in a transfer 260-pounder from Florida, Andrew Savani. He's a guy who's probably going to get some reps. He was injured during spring camp. They brought in a guy from Dartmouth, Jace Henry. He's 260 pounds, so I think he's going to get a lot of reps. But I think it's more like blocking tight end kind of situation. They've got a 6'7" kid from Australia, Jaden O'Rourke, who joined the team last year. He could get some reps. He'd be more of your passing guy, but I think it's they want the beef to be able to help the run game. Their tight ends coach, Virgil Green, played a decade in the NFL, Nevada alum, won a Super Bowl with the Denver Broncos. He's kind of young as a coach, and I think they're excited to see what kind of coach he can become. But there aren't a lot of game changers in terms of the pass game at that tight end position.
All right. We talked about it earlier and how important it is for this offense. So let's get to that offensive line. Senior left guard Zach Welch graduates, and their right guard Joey Capra hit the portal. They return left tackle Isaiah World, center Andrew Madrigal, and right tackle Frank Poso. Dylan Lopez comes in from Oregon State. Spencer Lavelle from Kansas. Snoop Leota Amama comes from Virginia, and Jacobus Set comes in from Washington State. How did the unit look this spring, and are they ready to roll in this new offense?
Yeah, I think they looked okay. You mentioned a lot of those transfers. They got a lot of power conference transfers, which is always good. Not a lot of those guys played a ton. Spencer Lavelle's played a decent amount. He's been at 3 different schools: Cal, Kansas, Arizona State. I think the returners, there's reason to be hopeful. I think Isaiah World can be one of the better left tackles in the Mountain West. He was originally a basketball player in San Diego in high school, and he's pretty relatively new to football being his primary sport. He's played a lot as a young guy, so I think he could be really good this year. Andrew Madrigal, he's a civil engineering major, very smart kid. He's a third-year starter at that center position, so I think he could be really solid as well. I think the group has a chance to be really good. I've just seen that they've really struggled the last decade plus. I mean, you go back to 2009, they've had 11 different offensive line coaches. That's really, really difficult to be able to build an offensive line, which usually takes a couple of years just because of how much weight you got to put on to be able to compete in a short order. So I think that is the big question mark on the offense in terms of if this is going to be an above average group. Nevada's been known for its offense really over the years because of Chris Alt. And the offense the last 2 years, it was terrible. Like they were a terrible offensive unit that was scoring, 15, 16 points a game. And that doesn't win at the college level. The offensive line is older, it's more veteran, and it's been bolstered by some of these power conference transfers. So I would give it probably an average grade, like a C+ during spring camp. And the big question is, can it get to be a B-? Because I don't think it's going to be an elite group, but I think there's enough returning experience where it can be a pretty solid group in the Mountain West and can help them form the identity they're looking for, which is, like we said, that run game. I mean, in his introductory press conference, Jeff Choate said, "I'm going to run the down ball." Like he's not making any delusions about what he wants to do offensively. He wants to play old school football. It's what he did at Montana State. It's what he's used to, and it's what he wants to do in Nevada.
Did anyone stand out to take over those 2 guard spots?
Not necessarily. There are some young players. Tyson Ruffins, he's an interior offensive lineman, and then Josiah Timoteo, he's a guard or a tackle body. Both those guys played the 4-game limit last year as true freshmen. So I would say those are 2 guys to watch out for. Ruffins in particular, I know they were pretty high on. So I think he's the guy who's probably going to win a job on the interior of the offensive line. But we also have like relatively small glimpses of the team. They've got 10 to 15 minute windows usually during stretching times that we got to see. Obviously, we got to see the spring game, but Ruffins and Timoteo were guys that the last staff was high on. They both stayed with this staff, and both of them got some starts as true freshmen, and they didn't play in that last game because they didn't want to burn those redshirt years. So I think those guys could have some bright futures.
All right, Chris, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2024, who would that be? And I'll leave it open to offensive linemen too.
And I will take an offensive lineman. I'll go with Isaiah World. I mean, like I said, this is a kid who was originally from San Diego. He was mostly a basketball player. He was recruited by Jay Norvell. Took him a year to kind of get the campus because we were kind of didn't know, what was going on with him. But since he's got here, he was thrown into the fire early. He was playing a little bit earlier than you'd like for a left tackle, doing that as a redshirt freshman. But he's a very athletic kid. I think he's a very competitive kid. I think he's got great length. He's 6'7". He's got, all of the frame that you would want at that position. And you could see him get better during his 2 years as a starter. So now coming in to a junior year, he was all Mountain West honorable mention last year. That's a guy who I think you can pinpoint and say this guy could be top 2 or 3 at his position in the Mountain West. And it's a very key position. I mean, left tackle is obviously hugely important. So that's a kid that I would watch that might fly under the radar, who I think could potentially be an all-conference player, first or second team at the end of this year.
All right. If you are watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. And if you are listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until next time, we are the G5 Hive.